Welcome everyone to the Wilmette Institute's webinar series, which has as its purpose to highlight the immense diversity of the Baha'i teachings and the ways they contribute to the contemporary world, and particularly to the prevailing discourses of society. Today, we turn to the approach the Baha'is are taking towards bringing about social change, our evolving framework for action. I am Dr. Robert Stockman, the Dean of Baha'i History and Texts at the Wilmette Institute. I have a PhD in History of Religion in the US from Harvard Divinity School, and I teach courses on Baha'i subjects at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and on religious studies at Indiana University in South Bend. Joining me today are two additional speakers on our panel. One is Dr. Justin Scoggin, and I'm very pleased to be able to say doctor because he has just completed his dissertation. It has been accepted, and he is now finished, except for walking and getting his diploma in another month or so. We are very excited and thrilled for him about that. His degree is being conferred by the University of Idaho. He's the Chief Academic Officer of the Wilmette Institute. Justin has helped develop learning outcomes for community and credit-bearing courses and programs for the Wilmette Institute and has helped align them to the current set of Baha'i global plans. He is currently exploring pedagogical principles for online learning coherent with learning outcomes. He has also worked for Fundaek, which is a Baha'i-inspired program in South America, as a teacher and program administrator. And he has also worked as a principal in a K-12 school in Ecuador, to be exact, the Galapagos Islands. And that itself is a fascinating story, which perhaps we will hear about some other time as well. Also joining me today is Ymasumac Marañón Davis. Ymasumac, or as we often call her, Ima, is an educator, writer, and consultant whose ancestry comes both from the Quechua people of Bolivia and the New England Pilgrims. She has been a teacher, administrator in education, published author, and international speaker. As course designer at the Wilmette Institute, she helps shift its pedagogy to be in alignment with the plans set forth by the Baha'i Universal House of Justice. She is currently a doctoral student in education for social justice, researching the role of narratives in shaping learning courses and cultures. So having finished our introductions, we will now turn to the first slide, and I'm the first speaker. I'll be then followed by Justin, and then finally by Ima this evening. So if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. And I need to advance my notes as well. We thought that it was probably a good idea to start by explaining that the Bahá'í Faith, while extremely concerned about social transformation, as you will hear tonight, is not just a social movement, but of course, obviously a religion, and we believe based on divine revelation. Baha'is emphasize that religions around the world have been founded by individuals we call manifestations of God. And we claim that God sends these prophetic figures to humanity periodically as human social and technological evolution create new moral and spiritual imperatives for social problems in society and such. The Baha'i scriptures recognize a series of individuals as manifestations of God. I have some listed here: Krishna, Buddha, Abraham, Moses, Zoroaster, Christ, and Muhammad. But in addition, the Baha'i scriptures recognize that tribal peoples from around the world have also received many kinds of prophetic figures throughout history, and that these individuals have infused their cultures with divine truth and beauty. As a result of this insight into the nature of religion, Baha'is emphasize the oneness of religion. In other words, that religion comes from the same divine source. Humans may understand it differently. They have used different languages. They have created different technical terms to explain their understandings, and then they, of course, elaborated on them in all kinds of different directions. But nevertheless, we recognize that all religions ultimately come from the same source, and therefore all of them are valid. None of them are from the devil. None of them are basically evil or anything like that, as is sometimes said by a few people around the world. In addition to these manifestations of God, however, the Baha'i Faith believes that God has sent two additional manifestations in the 19th century, and these are the founding figures for the Baha'i Faith. The first one, Ali Muhammad of Shiraz, took on the title of the Bab, and you can see he lived for about 31 years. He was then executed by firing squad in Iran for his teachings in 1850. He was succeeded by Mirza Hussein Ali of Nur, a town in northern Iran, and he took on the title of Baha'u'llah. He lived throughout most of the 19th century. As you might imagine, both of these individuals who lived in the 19th century had access to paper. They had access to large numbers of people who could read and write, and people who wanted to send them questions, write letters to them and ask them questions. And so both of them wrote prolifically and in many different genres. I list a few here: letters to people, theological treatises, prayers. We have entire prayer books of prayers that they've revealed, scripture commentaries, philosophical texts, legal texts, etc. Both of them produced somewhere between 5 and 6 million words, 18,000 works by Baha'u'llah, 2,000 works of the Bab that have survived from the persecutions of him. And therefore, the Baha'is are very much a religion of scripture. As I like to sometimes say, we don't have a Baha'ible. We have a scripture database because we have so much, and we have many books now available, Baha'u'llah's in translation into English. Baha'u'llah being the latter of the two figures, he is the principal source of guidance in the Baha'i faith. Yes, next, thank you. Throughout history, religions have faced two challenges after the passing of the founder. The first was preserving the original teachings of the founder in such a way that they can be understood from generation to generation, century after century, and then making sure that the understanding of those teachings remains a unified whole, so that there's not 20 million different ways of interpreting those texts, contradictory ideas as to what the texts mean, different ways of applying the text, etc. And this has been a problem that all religions have faced in the past. Until you get to Islam, even the preservation of the original teachings was extremely difficult because of the limited technology that was available in past ages. Failure to solve these two problems, of course, produced multiple sects. Christianity is said to have 22,000 of them currently, for example. Baha'u'llah has solved both of these problems for his own faith. First of all, he wrote everything down himself, or he dictated it to a secretary and confirmed the accuracy of the recorded notes that the secretary took. Baha'is do not consider anything that's just purely oral tradition from Baha'u'llah to be scripture. It might be interesting, it might be occasionally useful, but you can only go so far with it because it was never written down and confirmed by Baha'u'llah himself. So that solved the problem of transmission of the original teachings. In terms of interpretation, Baha'u'llah also insisted that his religion would have a series of individuals or institutions to succeed him who would have the authority to maintain the unity of the faith. He appointed Abdul-Baha, his immediate successor. So when Baha'u'llah passed, Abdul-Baha was immediately accepted by the vast majority of the Baha'i community. Baha'u'llah described Abdul-Baha as the authoritative interpreter and the perfect exemplar of Baha'u'llah's teachings. Abdul-Baha also wrote over 5 million words. And then Abdul-Baha in turn appointed a successor, Shoghi Effendi, who was authorized interpreter, was not considered a perfect exemplar, though certainly we have no problem with anything he did with his life. And he also produced over 5 million words. Baha'u'llah, Abdul-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi all wrote about how the Universal House of Justice would be established in the future, and it was then elected in the first time in 1963. It's a 9-member governing body, a coordinating body, which is authorized to legislate about Baha'i teachings and to organize and lead the Baha'i community. The Universal House of Justice's next election, by the way, is coming up in a few weeks. It's reelected every 5 years and has 9 members. Next slide, please. Well, the teachings of Baha'u'llah are relevant to many, many different topics. He revealed prayers, the importance of fasting, the nature of music and the value of music, how to raise babies, the importance of, all kinds of different topics, how to set interest rates, the mystic nature of our connection with God. So there's all kinds of range of teachings. Not all of these, of course, are immediately relevant to social change, though all of them are at least partially relevant, you might say. And in order to understand the Baha'i approach to human beings in general, and to social change in particular, there's a particular passage I have here selected from the writings of Baha'u'llah from Gleanings that I think is exemplary. He says, first and foremost, among these favors which the Almighty hath conferred upon human beings is the gift of understanding. His purpose in conferring such a gift is none other except to enable his creatures to know and recognize the one true God, exalted be his glory. This gift giveth human beings the power to discern the truth in all things, leadeth them to that which is right, and helpeth them to discover the secrets of creation. So we have here the notion that all human beings possess this faculty, this capability, the gift of understanding. And as a result, there is a very strong emphasis in the Baha'i faith and the oneness of humanity. We all occupy the same spiritual station in creation, and therefore there are ethical implications for the fact that we all occupy this same station. Furthermore, the thing that gives us that station is the gift of understanding. The gift of understanding helps us to recognize God, to search for the secrets in creation, and thus religion and science must both be based on reason in order to succeed. They search for and seek complementary truths. And so we view both nature and the spiritual side of the world as being created by the same God, and therefore as being complementary to each other and in conformity with the same overall creator and the same overall truths. Next slide, please. So some of these implications from these teachings of Baha'u'llah regarding oneness and equality. First of all, the gift of understanding implies equality of all people, that there are no superior or inferior races, classes, sexes. They're all equal. This obviously implies the equality of men and women. And when Abdu'l-Baha came to the United States in 1912, he said, and it made headlines in the newspapers, that women should have the right to vote. Of course, they didn't get the right to vote until 1920 in the United States. He had already insisted that they had the right to vote in Baha'i elections in the United States. And so the Baha'i community was already grappling with this whole new development and understanding of the relationship between men and women. One of the implications also of this, obviously, equality of the races, is the importance of lack of discrimination and the importance of abolition of prejudices. This gift of understanding means that we must overcome prejudices, because prejudices, after all, shape the way we understand things and warp our understanding of the world. Abdu'l-Baha strongly emphasized the equality of the races. When he came to the United States, he insisted on speaking in racially integrated public settings, and he even encouraged interracial marriage. Louis Gregory, an African-American lawyer, towards the end of Abdu'l-Baha's visit to North America, married Louisa Matthew, who was an English woman, white. And for the next 40 years, the two of them, sitting side by side in Baha'i meetings, were a reminder to the Baha'is that the oneness of humanity wasn't just an abstract thing, it was a very concrete reality that had to be understood and implemented even at the level of marriage. So this was a very important, I think you could say, very important development. The gift of understanding also means that people need to have a voice in decision-making, because everyone is capable of learning. Everyone is capable of coming to an understanding and sharing that with others. This is what the Baha'is call consultation, the importance of making decisions together about how to work on problems together, how to solve problems, how to live together successfully, how to organize our communities. And the gift of understanding and the oneness of humanity implies the importance that all must have access to education. And so this is another important principle of the faith, and that all must have access to the basic means of living. You can't really have a chance to become educated or to contribute to society if you're living on the street and begging for food. It's much more difficult to be able to contribute to society under those circumstances. And being able to create a society where there's a certain level of prosperity for everyone is another aspect of this Baha'i teaching that we'll hear more about. And then there's this also thought by Baha'u'llah worth emphasizing: noble have I created thee, yet thou hast abased thyself. Rise then unto that for which thou wast created. We are all created noble, and we must help each other to see our nobility, to find nobility in others, and to help all of us to strive to become more and more enlightened, transformed, and noble beings. Next slide. One more implication that I want to mention here: the gift of understanding can also be applied to both God and religion. So religion must be rational as well as being a mystical thing. The Baha'is do not deny the possibility of miracles. Miracles are not something we build our religion on. We don't consider them proofs, but we don't say they're impossible, because God, after all, is in charge of the whole creation and therefore can do what he wants. Independent investigation of truth is another implication of this Baha'i principle of the ability for everyone to understand. Everyone must be assisted and trained so that they can study and learn about the truth themselves, instead of having to listen to others and just follow others. Because everyone can investigate reality, there's no need in the Baha'i faith for a special clerical class to tell people what to believe or to train them. People can read books, some people can become experts in this or that, and they can then accompany others in their study, but there's no need for a special class of people. And the Baha'i faith has an absolute minimum of ritual. Ritual is something anyone can perform too, if there is a ritual in a particular case. And so there's no need for religious experts to do that. Baha'i communities are organized by elected coordinating councils, and the election occurs as a result of prayer, and there's no mentioning of names, no campaigning, no electioneering, either for or against people. So this also is a way of maintaining unity and helping really the spirit of understanding spread in the community. I've already mentioned the harmony of science and religion, because both of them are created by the same God, after all, and they both involve the same rational principles for study. And of course, this means that if we're talking about social transformation, such efforts from a Baha'i point of view must be based on all of these principles: the oneness of humanity, the nobility of all people, independent investigation of truth, consultation of all people, and the harmony of science and religion. So now I'll turn this on to Justin, who will continue this discussion.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's such a pleasure for us to be here with you all today, although I'd really like to be able to see you all, see your faces. That would help me a lot to be able to read the room and know how things are going. But just knowing that you're there is wonderful, and just being here with you all is just a fantastic opportunity. I'd like to kind of take advantage of the historical context and the context of principles that Robert has established here to think about the purpose of religion and how it in the Baha'i faith there is a dual purpose. So this is a quote from Abdul Baha, and as you can see, when he speaks about the purpose of religion, he mentions he focuses on souls, so individuals, but he also speaks of nations, so our collectives, and this points to how religion is necessary element for the transformation of both individuals and for communities, and not just small communities, all communities of all sizes up to the international level, and that this foundation, this spiritual foundation, is the same in all of the heavenly religions, is one reality. Next. Yeah, so I'm just going to take a little bit of a dive into the individual transformation first, and then we'll look at the social transformation. So this aspect of the individual transformation speaks to us in our path. So we all are walking a path in which we are searching for meaning. And when we search for meaning, we read the Word of God, we pray, we think about our own spiritual qualities, we think about our defects, right? We reflect on our defects, and we think about become inspired in the reading of the Holy Word about how to become a better person, how to reflect the nobility that Robert spoke of earlier. It's not always simple, not always easy to express that nobility. And again, Abdul Baha indicates here that in this process of individual transformation, becoming aware of our potential, he speaks of the knowledge of God as key to this process. And he also talks about how religion makes possible the discovery of the verities of life. Discovering the verities of life, I think, it's just a wonderful way of expressing how understanding our reality, our true reality, both social and individual. And I think that if all of us, all people kind of underwent this process, our communication would be a lot clearer, Okay, let's move on to the next one. Yeah, so briefly, very, very briefly, regarding the social aspect of the transformation that religion its purpose is to undertake. Baha'u'llah says all men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. So this is part of our DNA. This is part of our purpose as human beings, and that this ever-advancing implies the process of human development. The human development must progress from one generation to the next. And what's interesting is that it also implies that this progress should be sustainable over time. For something to continually improve, that means it's sustainable. Now, we're not talking necessarily about sustainable growth here. We're not using the terminology of the development literature, but more we're just looking at it at what progress is for all human beings. And this is one of our goals is to make sure that this happens. Now, this statement raises sustainable development, truly sustainable development, to the status of a spiritual principle. Baha'i teachings describe a new conception of the relationship between humankind and the natural world, in which the ecosphere is conceived as the extension of the human body. So it's not just social transformation as speaking of human groups, but also understanding our relationship with nature. Now, when we look at some of the principles that Robert mentioned, along with this dual purpose of religion, so one of these principles that Robert mentioned about the oneness of humankind and also the evolution of society that I was just mentioning, Baha'is call this a twofold moral purpose that each individual has. Now, this twofold moral purpose, again, is to work towards the transformation of myself as an individual, constantly thinking about how I can become a better person and reflect the nobility that we were created with, and how I can contribute to the transformation of society, of the people around me. So this individual transformation is, we speak of powers that should characterize a member of the human race entering its age of maturity. If we are truly entering our age of maturity, how do I contribute to that? And then at the same time, as we're contributing to that, what we're looking to make happen is this organic change in the structure of society. So we're not happy to just change things to make them a little bit better or to make them reflect a little more the nobility of humanity. No, both of them need to reflect each other. The nobility of the individual needs to be reflected in the structures of society. And I think this is really truly the challenge of the Baha'i faith, that each Baha'i has. Next. So when we think just a little bit about the kind of the development, of our society, we kind of wonder why the international development agenda works within a framework that does not respond to the true nature of humanity. Like it says here in this little quote, the majority of the world's peoples do not view themselves simply as material beings, responding to material exigencies and circumstances, but rather as moral beings concerned with spiritual awareness and purpose. So, the international development agenda, unfortunately, doesn't work under this premise. It treats people as material beings with many material needs. And of course, I'm not saying we don't have material needs. We do have many material needs, and they're extremely important, as Rob mentioned just a few minutes ago. But that's not it. That's not the whole story. And in fact, if that's the way we're acting, then the development that we're going to see in the world will not be satisfactory to the great majority of people. And I think that's kind of what, we can see that around us right now. Okay, next. I'm going to continue with this idea that spirituality needs to be at the heart of our development efforts. And so thinking about development, it must directly address the inner life and character of human beings, as well as the organization of society. And this goes along with what I've been mentioning this whole time, the dual purpose of religion, the twofold moral purpose of each individual. Development then needs to help each individual and the society express these noble ideas. It has to reflect who we are as individuals. It can't focus only on the material side or only on a certain other side. It has to. Development means that we develop as a whole, all of us together and as individuals, but all of the individual, not just part of the individual or part of my identity. So look, when we talk about promoting a process of social change, we're talking about cooperation, compassion, rectitude of conduct, and justice. A transformation that permeates every aspect of the relationships that govern human activity. And I'd really like to emphasize this quote here. It's all about relationships. And I think that we're discovering this more and more, that development isn't just about services. It's about establishing relationships that are meaningful, for everybody, in which people have a voice, like kind of Robert was also mentioning before, in which every single culture, every single group is allowed to understand the revelation of God for today and put it in and apply it according to their circumstances. So there, when we speak of like kind of this kind of transformation of our society, we're not talking about one single transformation in one single way. It has to be transformed in 100,000 different ways according to the spirit, the cultural needs of each people. But that doesn't mean that like the fracture of the cultures either. It allows us to communicate, but it allows the expression of the cultural expression according to to the people's needs all over the place. So it's, I guess the word we could use here is like a unity in diversity. And through this process, what we're doing is we're reframing what constitutes well-being. Because again, if we focus on the material needs only, well, then that's how we're defining well-being. That people are happy when their material needs are satisfied, and yeah, that is very helpful, absolutely, for sure. And spiritual and material development need to go hand in hand, for sure. But again, if we're going to rethink through religion what well-being is, then that needs to be expressed in our efforts to generate development around the world. Now you can change. Yeah, so I'm really glad that Robert mentioned the relationship between religion and science, because this comes up here again. If we're thinking about development, and we're thinking about understanding ourselves, our true nature, and understanding the nature of our society, and rethinking well-being, well, there are two sources for these. One is religion and one is science. There's sources of understanding for how we should develop. So devoid of dogmatic accretions, religion has imparted spiritual and moral verities that in no way contradict the discovered truths of science. The process of scientific discovery itself involves human faculties, such as imagination and intuition, in addition to reason. So science isn't reason devoid of intuition. Much of science is permeated by human intuition. The language makes it sound like it's only only focused on reason, but the truth is, the decisions that people made, even to get to that decision, were made intuitively. And so the science reflects our whole being as spiritual beings, as emotional beings, but also as reasonable beings. And so does religion. And both of them are sources of understanding that allow us to come together. And at the end here, it says, well, look, the historic dichotomy between reason and faith is a false dichotomy. They are complementary faculties of human nature that both engage in the process of discovering and understanding reality. They are both tools that enable society to apprehend truth. And I'm not talking about some absolute truth. I'm talking about moving towards an understanding, a broader understanding of truth. Which is kind of what we're doing as Baha'is, and I think then the next slide will speak to that. Yeah, so thinking about moving towards this transformation of the collectivity and transformation of the individual, we're thinking about, okay, so what does that mean? Finally, at long last, thinking about the long history of humanity, of thinking at a world level. And of course, since the 1940s, this has been happening, where we've been thinking at the world level through the United Nations, and this is a beautiful thing. But that's the United Nations isn't the final solution to humanity's problems. In fact, it needs quite a bit of reform. And Baha'is are very happy to contribute to that process of its success, but also its reform. And look, so it's based on a profound consciousness of the oneness of humanity, but remember, unity and diversity, always, in which justice is the central organizing principle and the well-being and prosperity of all peoples is pursued. Okay, next slide, please. So this is my last slide. And what I want to emphasize here is that this process of building a new society, both on the individual level and on the collective level, is something that we're not sure how to do. Baha'u'llah gave us principles and ideas, but it's up to us to apply those ideas to make them into reality. And again, this has to happen differently. So, some things are, you know, they're done in common, so we can learn from each other. But then their expression needs to be different in every single place around the world where that will, so that it's adequate or it's appropriate for that culture. So this whole idea of how we move forward is called the Baha'i Conceptual Framework for Action, and its purpose is intimately associated with a learning process characterized by an action reflection cycle where we're trying something out, we reflect on it, we think about it. Did that work? Did it not work? Why? How could it work better? Let's go back to the guidance. Let's try it out again. But it's a collective. We're consulting with each other. We're learning from each other. This learning cycle is a construct for being able to focus on learning how to translate the Baha'i teachings into action in a particular area. So again, all participation in this process requires all of us to have a posture of learning in which we recognize our own ignorance. And we also express our desire to learn, and we know that learning happens collectively. And I think that with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ima.
Yeah, one more slide, Justin. This last one that really helps us understand about this culture in which learning is in the mode of operation. I don't know if you want to say a few words to
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, this last slide is, I think I wanted to kind of tell a story with this last slide. And it's basically that the Universal House of Justice, which guides our development process, is asking us to accompany each other in this process of learning. And this word accompaniment, it's beautiful. And it's taking on a new meaning in this context. And it says here, this word that is endowed with new meaning as it is integrated into the common vocabulary of the Baha'i community. It signals the significant strengthening of a culture in which learning is the mode of operation. And I think this is kind of what we're trying to understand and establish. This isn't just some individuals or some institutions or a community or two that are understanding the Baha'i revelation and trying to figure out how to apply it in their particular area. No, the Universal House of Justice gathers learning from around the world and shares the learning with other communities so that each community in its own way can understand the Baha'i revelation and put it into practice. Now, again, there are many things in common that we have among Baha'i communities, but also the expression needs to be unique in many ways.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And yeah, nice to be here with everyone as well. Very, very excited about this entire conversation. And really thinking about this conversation, you know, going back from the very beginning where Robert was kind of giving us that like historical lens, right, in which this movement has been taking place, and the spiritual transformation of this planet has been, you know, happening, you know, over different spiritual dispensations, right? And then, of course, Justin, you know, really helped drive it home for us, you know, like, how is it that Baha'is are learning about the spiritual transformation then? If this is something that has been happening, you know, over time, you know, over humanity's history, then how are we learning about it today as a Baha'i community with our friends, right? Because really this is a process in which everyone is invited into participating, not just Baha'is. And so what I would like to really kind of center the rest of our conversation on and until we close is really like of all the different areas of learning, you know, that have emerged, really the Universal House of Justice has asked us to think about these three areas of endeavor, in particular in our communities at the grassroots level. Because in our communities where we live is where we can see that transformative process happening, you know, most clearly and participate so directly, right? It's very exciting. And so, you know, as you can see in this quote, there's three areas in which the Universal House of Justice guides our attention. You know, one being that area of community building, right? The other being the area of social action. And then finally, this area of how to engage in public discourse. And those are the three areas that I would like to expand on each one to kind of, you know, open them up within the context that Robert and Justin have laid out for us. So if we can go to the, you know, to that, you know, walk towards this conversation, maybe on this next slide, we can look a little bit at, you know, capacity building, right? Because if we're going to, you know, really learn about transformation, it's going to require certain things from us, right? Like there's certain skills and capacities I'm going to need to have in order to be able to participate effectively in this learning process. And so, you know, this concept of capacity building is really important for us to be thinking about. That capacity building really is something that happens over time, right? When you think about a capacity that somebody has at its most basic level, I think a good example to think about capacity building is just the capacity to walk, right? When you see small children, you know, like it's inherent within them, this desire, right? But it takes time, right? And we often accompany them, right? You know, hold their hands, you know, like they kind of tumble a bit, you know, but over time they get stronger and they get better at it, right? It's kind of very similar with all these other capacities that we have to develop, right? The capacity to be able to reflect, right? How do I reflect? How do I learn how to reflect regularly with people, right? The capacity to be able to read my reality. That's such a, you know, powerful phrase and such a huge concept. You know, how do I do that? Right. So each of these needs to be nurtured and developed and take time. However, this idea of capacity building, you know, the Universal House of Justice has helped us understand that it's also part of a process that's systematic in nature. Right. And so it's something that you do regularly, but through that systematic process, organically things can emerge. Right. So while it's systematic, by no means is it stifling growth. It is actually nurturing kind of this organic movement to occur as well. So it's pretty exciting. And that's really what, you know, Justin was trying to help us understand as well about, you know, this organic movement that's happening within this systematic process. And so again, just, you know, kind of strengthening on a little bit more into capacity building, recognizing that, you know, really for the Baha'i community, this is an area that distinguishes us, that we think about capacity within the context of service, right? That it's really in the field of service that these develop, right? And so if we just looking at this next slide, you know, what again, what we're learning about capacity building is that it's not just at the level of the individual. As important as that is, it is also important for institutions to build their capacity and for the community to build its capacity. So there's an individual capacity building, there's a collective capacity building, and there's an institutional capacity building, right? So it becomes layered, right? It's not just like the singular concept. What's really important, though, to remember, and it's something that, you know, we're really learning about, you know, as a community, is that these all interact, right? They're dependent on each other. So as the individual develops its capacity, inevitably, the institution will be impacted by its capacity, and inevitably, the community will be impacted by its, right? And vice versa, right? As an institution develops its capacity, the others will also be impacted. And so it's really exciting, right? Because now we can see this movement happening. It really becomes very much like, in my mind, I always think of like an engine, right? Not that I'm good at mechanics, so don't get excited if that's the direction you want to go in, but rather in a very simple way of just being like this engine that, you know, needs all of its parts to hum along. And as one part gets stronger, the other parts also can hum along more effectively, right? And so just keeping that in mind as we look at these three areas of endeavor, right? If capacity building is really the watchword in these areas of endeavor, then what is it that we're doing with these different areas? And so maybe if we look at this first slide on community building, and when we were preparing this together, none of us could get too far away from the beautiful words of the Universal House of Justice, because they have such an incredible way of laying this out for us of what it is that we're actually engaging in. So this concept of community building, if you just look at those two words, it really does not describe the beauty of what's actually happening. And so if you look at what the house is, described for us here, community building is really responding, right, to that inmost longing of every heart to commune with its creator. That's what community building is, right? And so what we do then with our friends is respond to that longing by creating spaces of devotion, right? Spaces of prayer, right? It could be spaces of prayer with my neighbors because it's something that we long to do together. It could be spaces of prayer with my friends because that's something we long to do together. Wherever it is, we begin to learn how to create these devotional spaces throughout the community in which we live, because we know that's something that we all long in our hearts, right? The other thing that community building is that it's also this desire for us to be together and to engage in meaningful discussions on themes of spiritual nature, right? And so, again, maybe I'm getting together with my neighbors on a regular basis to discuss these things, maybe with a few friends we get together, depending on your context, right? And where you live, you're going to be getting together regularly and having these like spiritual conversations, right? You're going to deepen your understanding of, this revelation that Baha'u'llah brought. Really understand what is his message, right? And then invite others to participate with you. Really, that's really what community building is. And you can see that there are capacities that will go with each one of those, right? Each one of those carries certain capacities, in order to be able to engage in them and to be able to carry them out. And they're not necessarily complex capacities, but they require something of you, right? They require the capacity to know, for example, how to just study a prayer with others, right? It requires something like that, something as simple as that. At the same time, it's something we have to actually practice doing, right? And so it's a process that you actually have to engage in. But if we continue forward a little bit longer in the next slide on community building, we see that community building also is very aware and conscious of the children in its community, right? Community building recognizes the need for children to develop this spiritual compass in which will guide them throughout their lives, right? And we're concerned about all the children in our community, so my neighbors and their kids and their grandkids and my grandkids and my children, right? We're concerned about them, and we want to help develop this strong compass within them, right? And so community building also means having children's classes, right? Ways of educating these children in our community, right? So that they have this strong, roots, right? That are founded in spiritual principles. And those are beginning to kind of grow in different pockets throughout our community, right? We also recognize that there's different age groups, right? So community building would also recognize, for example, that you have this age group of youth, but then a very special one of junior youth, right? That junior youth is that special age of kind of in between, right? One of my favorite places to be in between. And so you think of 11-year-olds to about 14, right? Just that special age group right in the middle there. And we call those junior youth, right? And those youth, have also a spiritual educational program for them called Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Groups, right? Or empowerment program. And so you have these groups now in which their special needs get attended to, right? And so that they then can become really empowered, right? To direct their energies, towards, the upliftment of humanity, right? And so it's really exciting, right? Because it's such an important stage. And then of course, community building also recognizes that more and more people need to build capacity to express, their faith, through, multiple endeavors in their communities, both in a material, but also in a spiritual dimension. And so again, this goes back to, that twofold moral purpose of transformation that we talked about earlier, right? Both at the level of the individual and at the level of the collective. And so that's one area of endeavor that the Baha'is and their friends are really learning about very systematically. How do we do this as we, kind of develop this new world in which we're trying to all coexist in together? And so then let's look at the next area of endeavor, which is this area of social action, right? And social action, is very powerful title, and sometimes can feel a little daunting because it can feel like maybe I need to have some really specialized skills to do this, right? And again, yes, we're going to need to have certain capacities to engage in social action, right? However, once again, the Universal House of Justice guides us really wonderfully and lovingly in understanding that social action, can actually range from very informal efforts, right? Between, a few individuals, a few friends, trying to solve a problem together, to something much larger and more organized and systematic in nature, right? And so, the range of social action, right, is really wide. And all of us, can participate in it. I think what's really important to remember, no matter the scale of the social action in which we're thinking about, is that really what social action is being thoughtful about how you apply the teachings and principles of the faith, of the Baha'i faith, right? To help improve some social or economic, situation in the life of a community, right? That's really what it is, right? And so in that way, if we do this in the way that was described earlier, which is really in this posture of learning, then there's a lot of humility, a lot of recognition of, that this is a learning process. We don't really understand yet. We're trying to figure it out. And that as I develop capacities, I will improve in my way of, engaging in social action. It's really wonderful because it kind of takes the pressure off of trying to get, social action right, for example. And really, in this way, our endeavors through social action can really address the needs of, promoting both the material well-being of a population along with its spiritual, welfare, so that we're not only addressing the spiritual needs and nature of humans, but we recognize that we live in a material realm and we need to address their material needs as well through these efforts of social action, right? And then finally, the final area of endeavor in which we're going to focus on tonight, recognizing that there are many more, but these are the three that we're really wanting to engage in, because the Universal House of Justice has asked us to really focus in on these in particular in our communities, right? And this last one is really engaging in public discourse, right? And again, engaging in public discourse sometimes can feel like you need to have really lots and lots of training to be able to participate and engage. However, again, we're given this wonderful, kind of understanding of engagement in public discourse from the Universal House of Justice, of, it being something that could be as simple as, just introducing Baha'i ideas into your everyday, conversations with your friends, to actually preparing, for a presentation, or, preparing for a conference or an important gathering, right, in which you're going to be discussing these themes. And these themes can range anywhere from, the conversations you have with your friends around, climate change and the environment, around human rights, addressing any of these issues, to also engaging, with, civic groups and local organizations and, that exist in your community, right? And so there's many ways in which one can engage in public discourse. But again, you can imagine that it will also require to develop certain capacities, right? And we cannot wait to develop those capacities. Capacities don't happen by waiting, just like that small child is not waiting to learn how to walk. They begin that process of learning how to walk and tumble along until they get stronger. And the same is true for building capacity, right? It's in public discourse, right? We don't wait in that case. So this final quote, maybe Justin, can I ask you to encapsulate this final quote for me? Sorry, I have some workers doing wonderful service here.
Yeah, sure. Everything we've been talking about today, that Robert gave us this contextual, this beautiful context with the history and also the principles and the oneness and justice. And then we're looking at the kind of this twofold purpose of religion, twofold moral purpose, and how these have been expressed in community development, in social action, and in engaging in public discourse. All of these represent ways of awakening the energies latent in the human soul and channeling them towards the betterment of society. Together, they are the means of releasing the society-building power of the faith. So the Baha'u'llah gave us a vision of what society can look like in the future. And it's our goal, it's our duty, it's our responsibility to work as hard as we can to alleviate suffering, to prevent suffering, and to establish well-being throughout the whole world. And so this presentation is given us kind of an overview of how the Baha'is are using that revelation to and learning how to express it in a way that creates unity and justice for all people all around the world.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ima and Justin. And we now are at the point where we have time for questions from our audience. And I do see one question already from someone. Robert asks if you could please comment about the meaning of accompaniment. Either of you.
Ima, I think you're the accompaniment expert here. Would you like to, do you have you have silence in your house to be able to do that?
I can try. I don't know if they'll come back up, but I can try. That's so funny. I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, well, go ahead, Justin, that's your jam. I think all of us really enjoy this concept of accompaniment. Yeah, I
think the way you always phrase it, of walking together.
Yeah.
For me, that's really that's really what helps me understand, is that when somebody rises up to do something, and then you say, hey, let's walk, allow me to walk along with you in doing this. I don't know, maybe you can. Yeah,
no, I think, yeah, when I think about accompaniment, I think of two friends walking together, right? And in this journey, we're going to just really lean on each other, right? And it's really, at least my understanding, accompaniment is this dual process, right? The friend, one of the friends is just a little bit more, ahead than the other. Ahead meaning they're a little bit more ahead on the journey, right? They've kind of just walked a little bit ahead and they've learned some things. And this friend also wants to learn similar things, right? And so they're let's do this together. And so then they accompany each other, right? And the one that's learned a little bit more, maybe will share some things. But ultimately, they both are impacted, right? They both are deeply impacted by this learning process. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It requires certain capacities in accompaniment that can really, at least in my estimation, only be developed as you accompany each other. For example, one of them is humility, right? It's recognizing that, I know some things, but chances are when we engage together, I'm actually going to learn much better and much more, right? And so that humility is there, and you realize, oh, just walking together helps me shape my own understanding even more effectively. So that's how I would approach it. I don't know if there's some other things, you know, Justin or Robert, that you feel is important that I've missed.
That strikes me as a good summary. It's interesting that the word accompaniment, of course, comes from the word company, and company and companion means someone you eat bread with.
Mm.
And so I think that's another interesting image to keep in mind where the word accompaniment is concerned.
Yeah.
We have a couple of other questions that people have asked, and I have a question as well that I'll pose if we get the chance. Robert says if he's doing a home visit with some people in his neighborhood, presumably, and his friends pray for me, is she accompanying me when she's praying for me?
That's such a beautiful question. I so love that. And I mean, in my estimation, accompaniment, you know, is also mystical in nature to a certain extent, right? Like we don't know how we're being transformed by each other. And so definitely prayer is a part of that, right? I mean, there's a mystical aspect to prayer, you know, and so if I'm praying for your efforts, you know, that home visit be a good home visit, that the hearts be more in love with each other by the end of that home visit, you know, I mean, if there's, you know, that kind of like purposeful prayer, but imagine, of course, it's, you know, it's a form of accompaniment with each other. I think accompaniment also requires being part of that process of learning that, you know, Justin was referencing earlier. So like after, you know, we get together, we reflect, how'd it go? You know, what emerged from that? Then, you know, like that's where the learning comes from with accompaniment, right? Because then I'm going to learn from you and you're going to learn from me and I'm going to reflect on it. And of course, prayer is a part of that, but the reflection is a necessary element. And maybe in that reflection process, we're going to realize we need to learn more. And so then we're going to go get some guidance, or we're going to study the guidance together and say, oh, actually in the home visit, this happened, but look, the House of Justice says this. And so you start studying that together, right? And so you can see how it's very rhythmic in that way. It's a beautiful way of kind of learning together, because at least for me, it takes the pressure off, and it's just a great deal of joy that happens between two souls as they learn together about transformation.
Justin, I don't know if you have anything to add. I have another question here by Philip. Philip says, thank you for this uplifting presentation on a very important topic. How is the decision of what its elements should be made, and how are the new elements added? Who directs the conceptual framework? So where do the elements of it come from, and how do you add elements to it? And then he adds, is the framework for action different from the conceptual framework? Are their elements the same or distinct?
Go ahead, Robert.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I think you all are the ones who've been talking about the framework the most. Obviously, in terms of the elements of the framework, that's something that I think probably grows and develops through experience, and then eventually the House of Justice will say, yes, we add this framework, add this to the framework, we add that element to it. But it's something that is an organic process also that gets endorsed by the head of the faith. Sometimes the head of the faith might say, let's try this, and then people try it. Other times people try things, and then the head of the faith says, this is great. Let's let everybody know about it. So in terms of the elements that get added, I think that's the obvious answer to that question. And of course, the elements have been defined also in a Ruhi book. This is a series of books that the Baha'i World Center has authorized for publication that are used around the world, and they're used in dozens and dozens of languages. I'm sure they have it translated into Quechua now as well, right, Ima? Presumably. But the books contain, there's already a book which describes the conceptual framework quite well. I'm not sure if I would talk about a difference between a conceptual framework and a framework for action, though. It seems to me the conceptual framework is the framework you use for action.
Yeah, I think the only thing I could add to that is that when we speak about how the Universal House of Justice makes this decision, they're making this decision with this amazing network of communication happening all over the world. So this posture of learning isn't only for individuals, and it isn't only for local institutions. It's also for the supreme body of the Universal House of Justice. They are also in a learning mode, and this is what's beautiful: is that they're attitude of learning is the model for all the rest of us individuals and all the rest of the institutions around the world. And so there are international bodies, there are continental bodies, there are national bodies and local bodies, and even sub-local bodies, like in, like a nucleus. So the learning that the House of Justice gleans from different people going and doing different things around the world is systematized and shared back to the Baha'i world, where we can try something out and say, oh, look, this is beautiful. Look at this, what's happening over here in this other place. They did this, it worked, let's try that out, but according to our local circumstances here. And if it starts to work really well and things gather steam, that learning will go right back up to the World Center. And so this back and forth of this learning process, it's the reason that the Baha'i world is advancing, is that we can talk about this today, is because the Universal House of Justice can then say, look, the patterns that we're seeing around the world indicate that these are the 3 areas of endeavor that are really effective. There are others, and maybe in the future we'll add more and more or take some away, but right now these are the 3 that are really where we want to go. So let's all move towards that. And so in unison, we move towards that, but in a diversity of ways.
Yeah. And, I think it's worth pointing out that this is not just the mode of operation of the House of Justice. It was the mode of operation of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi as well. Baha'u'llah, he provided revelation from God, but people wrote him letters. And he wrote letters in response to people. And the vast majority of Baha'u'llah's writings are letters in response to people. So they are part of an interactive process between the people who knew about Baha'u'llah and could write him, and Baha'u'llah's access to innate knowledge. This was also true of Baha'u'llah's son, Abdu'l-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi, his successor as well. They were receiving huge numbers of letters. There are stories of Abdu'l-Baha dictating letters in Arabic to one scribe and then turning to another scribe and dictating a letter to him in Persian and going back and forth because the scribe couldn't keep up. So he'd be doing letters alternately in the 2 different languages. That's why we have 30,000 documents from Abdu'l-Baha, because it was an incredible flood of correspondence. Another comment here, well, I'm not really sure if this is a comment, but a person is asking about the slide on the covenant and the fact that the meaning of the teachings in the past have been misunderstood. And he says perhaps that's not really a failure, perhaps it was just part of God's plan, that particular religion couldn't achieve greater unity at that time. And I think that personally that may be true, but I don't know if we want to elaborate on that particular question right now, because it's difficult to explain, I think, quickly. Then Christopher says he's new to the Baha'i Faith. What book can I get to learn more about the Universal House of Justice? Ideas? Baha'i.org. I'd say start with Baha'i.org.
The Baha'i website, the official website, yeah.
Start with Baha'i.org and see what it has to say about the Universal House of Justice.
But also you can learn about, you can actually read the Constitution of the Universal House of Justice. And it's an amazing document. It's truly, you'll never see anything like it. It's amazing, and it really will help you understand the origins of the House of Justice, that it comes from Baha'u'llah himself. It's the limitations that it has, the responsibilities that it has, to gather the Baha'is around the world, to provide guidance, to maintain unity around the world. And so, yeah, you can, I don't know, that for me, that might be the best option.
It's probably, go ahead.
I would also say that if you have already, hopefully, if you've already begun kind of your own studies in the Bahá'í Institute, when you get to book 8, which is on the covenant, you're going to get this wonderful history leading up to the kind of the creation of the Universal House of Justice, its role. And it's a beautiful series. It's 3 kind of elements, units to book 8 that really are going to help you understand this. So that's another place to go. If you haven't started the institute process yet, we'd want to start with book 1 because it really builds you up towards it. And also it has capacities we have to develop. But that's a good place as well.
Probably worth mentioning also that people can Google Baha'i Reference Library, and that will pop up a website where all of the published writings of the Baha'u'llah, Abdul-Baha Shoghi Effendi, and selected works by the House of Justice are all available in English. And you can also click through to find the ones in Arabic and Persian that are publicly available on that same website as well. So there is a huge amount of material available that way. Wikipedia also, believe it or not, has some very good articles on the Baha'i Faith because they've been carefully curated by several Baha'is who are really very concerned to make sure they're thorough and accurate. I have another question that I thought I would pose to the two of you about this Baha'i evolving framework for action where social transformation is concerned. How is it different from other efforts to bring about social change? Big difference. There's some big differences, I think you can say.
Well, I mean, just on its face, if you look, for example, at what, many of the efforts of the United Nations, which are beautiful, very extremely important efforts that are, it's transnational. So that at least the United Nations gets us out of this framework of, of a kind of a selfish order where nations only think of their own well-being. So that's a first step. Getting out of this kind of trap of thinking only about what's best for my nation, right? But then second of all, I think what we mentioned previously was that, many of the efforts that are wonderful, that are happening around the world, focus entirely on material needs. And so that's something we pointed out during the presentation as well, that this is not reflective of human nature. Human nature is spiritual, it is also material, therefore development needs to respond to both aspects of human nature. And the United Nations does an amazing job to being inclusive, to really trying to include all kinds of people. But at the same time, the structure of the United Nations allows for some nations to dominate the discourse and to say no to certain initiatives that might really be good for most other nations. So the structure of the United Nations doesn't think in a way that's only about well-being. It still is kind of trapped in this in a structure of nations and of the world capitalist economy. It's still kind of, there's it's very strong roots in these things. So.
And how would you contrast the Baha'i approach to the approach of nonviolent civil disobedience, for example, which is another very important way of bringing about change? People go protest. People, break the law in order to make a point.
Yeah.
And how would you contrast the Baha'i approach to that?
Yeah, reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s writings and also reading Mahatma Gandhi's writings are truly inspirational, and the things that they accomplished are extremely necessary for their time. However, the Baha'i approach is very careful to not be adversarial. We approach change right now in a way that says, well, if we're going to change, that means that the people, we're assuming that there's always going to be somebody who is on top and somebody who's on bottom, somebody who can control the situation and others who do not control the situation. And I think that the Baha'i world would like to put that aside and say, wait a minute, if we're actually trying to do something that's good for all of us, then we don't need to compete or fight over resources. We can actually sit down in a civilized way and consult with each other and think about how to distribute resources, how to distribute power in a way that is dignified for every single group and everybody involved.
I can also just add a few more things, and even to your previous question. I mean, I think one of the most distinguishing features that, for Baha'is and the framework for action and what we're doing is that we have access to Baha'u'llah's revelation. You know, I mean, I always think about, you know, like the early Christians, they had access to Christ's dispensation. Those who did not have access to that, you know, were kind of bereft of what Christ came to bring the world. You know, the same thing with the Buddha, right? And his dispensation. And so it's true in this dispensation, right? You know, those who have access to Baha'u'llah's revelation, it's transformative, right? But, you know, this framework has that, right? The other thing I was thinking of is that, you know, and in the Baha'i faith, there's this acknowledgement of that there were certain means that were acceptable for a certain time period,
yep.
And they're just not acceptable now, right?
Yep.
And so these means that, you know, communities had to engage in order to preserve themselves from, you know, social injustices, you know, may have been appropriate at that time, you know, but we know at this time, the means have changed, right? And so now we have different means, right? Again, I think it's based on capacities. Our capacity as a global community has shifted and we have learned. And so now we can rise to that. You know, I imagine, you know, 50 to 100 years from now, the capacities that this global community will have will be really different. And then they will also be rising to a different station, right? And so we kind of each move in that way.
Yeah, I like to think.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Notice I don't want to miss the question that's in here, so I just want to.
There's one more. There is another question which we'll get to, I think, in a second. It occurs to me that there is indeed a kind of evolution, like you said. When Genghis Khan decided to conquer most of Asia, you couldn't have had nonviolent civil disobedience to protest him, because when he went to a city, he told them to surrender or he would kill everybody and cut off their heads, and that's what he usually did. Nonviolent civil disobedience wouldn't have been of any use in that particular situation of extreme violence and terrorism. We're very blessed that we live in a society with public media and the means for these kinds of things to work nowadays. And to some extent, I think you would agree there's still some need for them. But the Baha'i community is aiming for a higher mode of transformation, a mode which does not try to create unity through means of disunity. And that, of course, is something that is a mode that is still trying to emerge, really. And this is something we very much are very concerned about as Baha'is, helping to bring about in the world. One other question here by Robert. How does the Baha'i process of community building include individuals who are not religious, such as people who don't believe in God, or perhaps sometimes people who are spiritual in nature but have no other interests? I think that's an easy one to talk about with the notion of what we call the community of interest. Increasingly, we want to encourage large numbers of people to join us in these community building processes, these social action and public discourse efforts, whether they accept Baha'u'llah or not. It doesn't matter. There's a contribution that they can make to these processes that we think are themselves ultimately of great value to humanity. And we want to encourage everybody to come and join us in this effort to bring about social change in a unified way. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know if it's, I'm not going to define something's right or not, but what I will say is that I absolutely love that question, because, what it makes me think of is, Baha'u'llah said that, when he came, he drew a circle of unity, and everybody's in, right? So everybody's in this circle of unity around the world. We're all in, nobody's out. And so, it's not, my job as an individual is not to figure out if you're in or out of the circle, you're already in. So my job is to figure out how to, not only collaborate with you and engage with you, but also love you, right? To be deeply in love with you. And so it's really wonderful, because this community building effort and this framework for action has room for that. It has room for everybody to be able to participate in that way and to learn from each other and to reflect together. And, you know, these friends who have different ways of engaging with the world and thinking about the world, you know, we want to learn with them, you know, and want them to help us understand more deeply, right? And so all of that is welcome, right? It's all within this framework. And so, at least from my understanding, you know, it's a learning process. And so I get to learn with you about this movement. I get to learn with you about transformation, because my assumption is if you're walking with me, you're also interested in transformation, both individually and collectively. And therefore, you know, how will we do that together? Because you're coming from a different position of how you're viewing the world. And I'm curious, right? And that's one of the things that we bring in this learning process, is that curiosity. So those are my thoughts about that approach. I don't know if either of you have others.
I think that's very good. Robert says, thank you for thoughtful comments. So that's very good. I think we have reached the end of our comments today. So if either of you have anything to add at this point before we wrap things up?
No, I don't.
Okay, very good.
It was really wonderful.
It's been a wonderful panel.
In many ways, for everyone, you've kind of just, you know, glanced through a window of like our regular conversations that the three of us engage in, which is really fun.
This does sound very much like Wilmette Institute staff conversations that we have actually quite often. Quite often. Yeah. So that's very good. So I want to thank everyone for joining the Wilmette Institute's webinar today. We hope you will share some of the ideas and information that you've heard today in your conversations with others, and please tell others about this webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel within about 24 hours. We look forward to seeing you again at a future webinar. Thank you for joining us, and good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.